Before the general election, Labour embarked on a huge charm offensive of the business community. However, since taking control, they have slapped on extra taxes for bosses with the national insurance hike, increased the national minimum wage, and imposed additional rules around employment law. Is the government's honeymoon with commerce over already? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
So guys, welcome back to the Den and to our latest podcast. And this week we're focusing on Labour and business. I think it's fair to say that if you listen to some of the leading voices in industry, from hospitality to farming, Labour are pissing people off. So is the criticism fair, or was it inevitable that there'd be a bit of a resetting in terms of the relationship between the public and private sectors? Another criticism, of course, of the government is that huge investments are being made into the public sector without, it seems, the sort of reforms being demanded that people thought would be inevitable and be asked for. Jim, what are your thoughts on this? Because I know that early days you were suggesting that some of these big pay increases, train drivers particularly exercised you, were being given a bit too easily.
Yes, and I remain of that view. I saw Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, on a programme yesterday, trying to explain away how she'd given, particularly to the train drivers, which is my particular beef, because I think that this is particularly egregious, giving them a big pay rise without any of the conditionality that the travelling public would expect. And as I think I said last week, I don't think there's anything socialist in inconveniencing the public by having voluntary working on a Sunday, for instance. So, but generally speaking, the government's argument is that they settled long-running industrial disputes with the doctors and the nurses and the train industry, and that was the justification for it. But I do think it was done in a rush, and it should have been conditional, because I think the government would then have been able to show the total vision of Labour coming into office, because there's still this residual thing. We all know the unions aren't as powerful as they were, but there's still this residual thing that the Labour politicians jump as high as the trade union leaders want them to. I mean, it's a thing from the 1960s, and it's not particularly relevant, but it's always something that Labour's reputational people have got to bear in mind. And there was the spectacle of this very generous pay increase being given to these public sector workers without any conditionality. And we'll see now, in respect to the health service, I see Wes Streeting beginning to sort of wave the stick at the NHS after being given 22 billion in the budget. So it seemed to be cart before horse, but maybe Wes has got an overall strategy for that. As far as the wider business community is concerned, I mean, the growth rate was poor, and most of it, July, August, September, was on Labour's watch. Now, obviously, it's affected massively by the fact there was a Conservative government beforehand, but it's just the beginnings of the fact that Labour's now in office, and the economic statistics that come out will be put at their door, and the black hole argument will begin to fade. So I think there's quite a difficult relationship with business at the moment, because it does seem to be contradictory to the growth agenda. I mean, if employers are going to be more cautious about taking people on, and if investment is affected, it could be quite tricky for them. Now, obviously, just last thing to say is that the investment summit just before the budget did pump quite a lot of money into the economy. But there's other global things, which I'm sure we'll come back to, which could affect business as well.
Yeah, it's not been a easy start for the government across the board, either with the wider electorate, with some of the things that are happening on the international stage, which we'll come to later perhaps, But this relationship with business, Joe, seems to have soured rather quickly. And surprising, really, because prior to the election, we as a business organisation were heavily courted by people such as Johnny Reynolds, who's the business secretary. And it seemed to me that they were saying, look, there will be some tough decisions to be made, but we want to work with you as partners. And my sense is that a lot of these rules, regulations around employment law, for example, the increase that has been, forget that fire alarm, it's it'll go off in a second. It seems to me that they've not really given the sort of consultation and had the conversation that businesses may have expected.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why businesses across the board are so fed up, because, as you say, they were courted, they were engaged, and now it appears that the government hasn't listened and hasn't taken on board any of the real concerns. And what they're doing now is they're digging in and they're saying, no, we're going to stick with the inheritance tax on farms over £1 million. We're going to stick with this, that, and the other. And it's leaving people a little bit bereft. I mean, a couple of things, just going back on what Jim was saying. I think it's fair to point out, and again, it's of the government's own making, that one of the reasons for slow growth in the last quarter was, I think, the uncertainty over what was in the budget. And we've talked about that before, that ridiculously long wait for the budget, which was so leaked in advance, but everybody was waiting. I don't take much notice really of, it's going to cost jobs, we're not going to hire people, minimum wage. We heard all of that before when the minimum wage first came in and the living wage. And I think that will change. But I think, this whole business of giving money to the public health, to National Health Service and public sector, and then saying, but we're going to name and shame and sack the chief executives of health trusts. Well, we all know how long and how difficult and how expensive that would be. And it is, as Jim says, it's the cart before the horse. They don't seem to have quite got their house in order. And I think, I hate the term vision, but, what is the vision for growth when you've got businesses struggling? We've got, an awful lot of events going on that we have no control over. But where, and what are the good things that are working? I mean, they're not shouting about stuff that they are doing, which is good. And what's happening to the house building? I mean, we saw over the weekend house builders coming up and saying we can't possibly deliver in that time. Where are the changes to planning? Where is the changes to net zero? People need to now feel as though something is changing, and at the moment it doesn't feel as though anything is. It just feels as though things have got worse.
Rachel Reeves did, in a Mansion House speech, re-emphasise Labour's commitment to changing regulations, ensuring that planning was going to be more effective. Also made announcements to tweaking how pension contributions can be invested, and that was largely welcomed by the finance markets particularly. But then you're right, Joe, there's a number of people in the house building trade who are saying that this 1.5 million homes over the period of the Parliament is for the birds, really. And again, we've seen governments before commit themselves to changing planning regulation. Well, you have all sorts of challenges then, not just from local authorities, but from local residents and voters, and of course from some of the backbench MPs who will be, one eye on their poll in 28 or 29. So it's not an easy thing to deliver, but without that, they are going to find it hugely difficult to get anywhere near that 1.5 million target. I think the other thing that they've underestimated, perhaps, is the fact that we actually haven't got the skill base in this country anymore to build 1.5 million homes. So where's the injection of cash? Or where is the deal with Europe to start freeing movement again, to enable us to import the workers that we need to deliver some of these very ambitious targets? And my thinking on the growth question, Jim, which you quite rightly raise. And okay, it's only 3 months into this new government. Can we really blame them for quarter one? Well, the delay in the budget didn't help, that's for sure. But are we moving to the inevitable conversation, as the Bank of England governor has said this week, closer ties with Europe? That is the only way in which we are going to genuinely be able to grow our economy, James.
Yes, well, no surprise that I'm absolutely in favour of that. We've discussed interminably on this podcast what I call the cowardice of British politicians, particularly on the left in the Labour and Liberal Democrat Party, to even countenance this, because they're frightened of in any way contradicting a vote, which is now nearly 10 years ago, by the way. But I have to be fair, in my advocacy of Europe, I have to recognise that it isn't the shining example that it used to be. Germany's economy is in real trouble, and Macron's got his problems as well. And also there is a question. We're not going into Trump this week, but if tariffs were imposed and the European Union decided to retaliate, there's some speculation in the weekend press that Trump would try and pull us away from the European Union and offer us some sort of deal, because he's no particular fan of the EU. So I still think, as you say, that the loosening up the freedom of movement would be a good thing. And by the way, when people are actually asked, who do you actually want to stop coming into this country? Do you want to stop fruit pickers? Do you want to stop people who work in the care services or the hospitality industry? Or individually, all say no, and you're almost left with, well, who actually do you want to stop? And it is obviously unemployed people who don't share our values. So
and have a different colour to us, Jim.
Well, yes, to a certain extent, but you're tempting me to go down the rabbit hole of immigration. But I know well the Cresta Court Hotel, which is right in the centre of Altrincham, which in the dead of night was populated by undocumented migrants. And if you're going to describe the reaction of the local public as racist, I'm afraid you're not. I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'm just saying that sort of thing is got to be handled very, very carefully. But
absolutely, it's a much bigger issue, and that comment of mine was probably a little too flippant. But nevertheless, there are people who we know, when they decided to vote to come out of the EU, and we've seen them being interviewed in Vox Pops, didn't we? Mm-hmm. There's too many black people in the country. Much to their chagrin, then the numbers of people from ethnic minorities in terms of colour has increased, and that's not that wasn't the plan in their heads, if I can put it that way. But the thing is, Joe, we can say that Trump might have this oven-ready deal. Can we use that phrase?
Oh God!
To offer the UK, but the fact remains that the EU is still way above our biggest trading partner, and the most natural place for us to be doing a deal with, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's proximity. I know it was a great shock to Dominic Raab when he was Foreign Secretary that he didn't realise how close it was to the UK, which is astonishing, really. But there's very little surprise as we about
forgotten about that.
God, I didn't realise it was so close. But in return for what? That we take America's chlorinated chicken, that we undercut British farmers with American beef, all of that sort of stuff. I mean, it is bonkers, and I don't think we want to go down the ghastly rabbit hole of Trump necessarily, because that is a whole 39-part series on nonsense. But yes, you're absolutely right, Frank. It is there, it's on our doorstep, and it is still our biggest trading partner, even post-Brexit. And I've noticed that quite a lot of people, particularly in the sort of the horticultural industry, are adding on and putting on the bill an extra £138 on the cost of whatever it is due to Brexit. And the impact that it's having on small businesses is far greater than the impact of the government's, maybe not very well thought through budget. And I think that's why businesses are so fed up, because in a way, I think they had, without going back to rejoining the EU, which is not going to happen, but the sense that some of this nonsense would stop, that actually things would be made a lot easier. And in the meantime, you've got the daftness of tuition fees going up, albeit by a very tiny amount, but vice chancellors on salaries in excess of £300,000 a year. Well, where's the government saying, hang on a minute, we've got to do something, because it's, in the end, it's about equality. And if you feel as a small business that you are not being treated as fairly as somebody who is sitting in a vice chancellor's office in a university going, well, we've got no money, we're going to have to cut all these courses, you're going to feel pretty fed up, in the same way as the farmers are understandably fed up. I mean, I think they are possibly not looking at the detail of the inheritance tax, but again, it comes back to this: no, we're sticking with it, we're not going to listen to you. And that is no way to govern a country. You've got to listen to people, even if you then say, yeah, we've listened, but we can't do anything about it. But to say, no, we're not having a conversation, it's ridiculous.
We say every week communication strategy has been poor from the government. We thought that might change when Morgan McSweeney took over from Sue Gray. Sue Gray, just to say, decided not to take on that alternative role that had been offered as ambassador to the regions or envoy to the regions. So Sue Gray is no more as far as the government is concerned. We may come back to that subject at some point in the future. But the message that seems to be coming across, and I'm sure this is unintentional, but it's public sector good, private sector bad. These guys in the private sector have had it easy for a number of years. We're going to start to clamp down now in terms of employment law, in terms of wages, and in terms of, well, if we're going to get more taxes out of people, let's go straight to the bosses. And whether that is the attitude or not, and knowing many ministers as I do, many Labour MPs, I'm sure it's not. But if that starts to be seen as the culture within this government, then it really is going to have businesses hitting back hard. And I noticed the comment from Steve Morgan, again, a house builder, who saying over the weekend in the press, well, I didn't vote Conservative, but I wouldn't vote Labour because I knew the Labour Party wouldn't change its spots and it doesn't like business. As I say, I think that is an unfair criticism, but I can understand how people are taking what's going on at the moment, wrapping that up in the perception of, well, if you're a train driver or if you're in a trade union, you're going to get your pay rise, but if you're a boss, you're going to be getting clobbered. And that is the problem, Jim, isn't it? Again, where is that communication? As Joe said, where is the vision? What are they saying about where this money is going to go, what it's going to be used for? Is it simply going to be thrown at the NHS, which we know is a black hole, and there's going to be no reform and no real improvement?
Well, there's a disparity between the rhetoric and what you've just described, because Johnny Reynolds and many others have constantly said how they want to work with business, and taking a page out of New Labour's book, that Peter Mandelson, perhaps soon to be our ambassador in Washington, but I mustn't go down that rabbit hole, was incredibly relaxed about people being multimillionaires, providing they paid their taxes. I mean, there is a criticism of business that the investment has been woeful, and that's one of the reasons why they want to consolidate all these local government pension funds to try and get investment, because apparently smaller pension funds look for quick gains, whereas if you've got massive pension funds, they're more likely to invest in infrastructure. Well, let's hope it's in the UK rather than somewhere else. But I mean, in terms of what they've said publicly, they've given every impression of being in favour of business and realising that it's only through business that we get growth. But of course, there are these headwinds for employers. the things we've talked about, in particular, the national insurance contributions. But there's also these other things which I've got to be in my bonnet about. The sort of suggestion that the government be relaxed about 4-day weeks, about working from home. I think all those things drag on the economy and make it more difficult for employers.
Yeah, Starmer did rule that out this week and said, well, 4-day weeks within the civil service, at least, which of course is what he has control over, ain't gonna happen. So I think some of that is people from the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph perhaps being a bit mischievous, but nevertheless, those stories take hold and people think, oh, Labour a bit soft on workers. I have to say, in terms of the employment law and the legislative changes that are taking place there, some of that was necessary. I'm quite close to somebody who's got a HR consultancy, and she says, yeah, some of these changes were needed to protect workers. But her argument for many years now, and certainly as somebody who works with businesses who are very, very good in terms of employment rights and making sure they look after the staff, ACAS is the place where they need to be really beefing up the role of that organisation so that there is a balanced approach to these disputes that happen from time to time in the workplace. And, the number of people who end up being dragged to tribunals after ACAS have said there is no case to answer is disgraceful, really, because what businesses usually do is they say, oh, let's just pay the £3,000 and move the case away because it's taken too much of our time. So, again, businesses are feeling a little bit sore that with all this employment law legislation, it appears that the government is saying, well, we've got to really clamp down on the bosses, without saying, well, actually, we're going to give a bit more resource to ACAS and they can genuinely get involved and have the final say on some of this stuff before it gets to the tribunals, which are massively costly, both to the public purse, but also to business too.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Frank. Many, many years ago when I was an industrial correspondent, I used to spend half my life at ACAS, or at least outside. And actually, you don't even hear it mentioned these days. And I'd be surprised if many businesses even knew of its existence. I think, the other thing is, and again, it comes back to this narrative, this image, this perception. Why are our water bills going to go up? Why is the government allowing that? We know that there needs to be investment in water, but that hasn't happened. So why aren't they doing something? I know it's not as easy as I'm going to make it sound, but why aren't they doing something to stop the excessive money going to shareholders and do something that looks more punitive? Because on the one hand, they're going, oh, your water bills are going up, and all this stuff about employment rights. It's fine and it's important, and I'm all in favour of good, safe, working practices. But for a lot of people, for instance, those in the hospitality industry, where you are, you're dependent on the number of bookings in a restaurant or the seasonality of where you work, you're not actually going to benefit at all. And actually, you've got employers saying, well, I've got to pay this much extra, so actually I can't afford to keep you on an ad hoc basis. So it's a circle. And I think part of the problem is that while Keir Starmer, and I think it is important, and I said it in my blog last week, he does need to be out there on the world stage, but he also needs to be looking at what's going on at home. Where's Angela Rayner, for goodness sake?
Plotting.
Yeah, that acts as a good segue into our conversation for the second part of this week's podcast, Joe, which is the air miles that Keir Starmer is clocking up. But before I close the conversation on sort of public-private sector relationships, I'm wondering whether the mayors of the North are feeling particularly pleased with the government after the announcement Louise Haigh has made on HS2 at the weekend to say, yes, the Birmingham to Euston leg will now be completed, but ruling out Birmingham to Crewe. Jim, Andy Burnham, for one, is not going to be particularly pleased with that announcement.
Absolutely not. And particularly because I think he was largely working on a private sector initiative. So in a sense, if the land is protected, which I understand it still is, no land's been sold off since Sunak's announcement a year ago, and the private sector were going to fund it. But I guess there would have been government funding as well, which is what she's cut off. No, it's extremely disappointing. And as I think we've said before, it's going to be interesting to see how this very powerful group of mayors from all over the country, directly elected with their own mandates, and what the relationship is going to be between them and the central government. I mean, Ben Houchin from Tees Valley, of course, will always be available to stir the pot, but it's obviously largely a Labour affair, and I think that is a poor signal. And the whole saga has been so sad that we're unable to get these big infrastructure projects underway. And let's hope now that the government really do get behind Northern Powerhouse Rail, which in some people's view is the greater priority to link up across the country from Liverpool through Warrington, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford.
But you were at our event on Wednesday, Jim, and Steve Rotherham was talking about the whole network and was basically saying an integral part of improving Northern Links was that connection to Crewe. So I don't get the intricacies or the technicalities of these infrastructure projects in terms of why you'd need to get a faster train from Birmingham to Crewe. But equally, we are told, as a business that operates across the country, it's important to us that under the plans that have been previously announced, you have to have a slower train going from Birmingham to the north because of the way that the tracks are being laid. Now, as I say, I don't get the technicalities, but it doesn't sound to me that we're looking at the north as an opportunity, as a place that if we can start to invest there, then we start to uplift and rebalance the economy of UK PLC. And that for me is disappointing. We'll see if there's alternative plans emerging over the next few weeks. But unless and until Labour come up with that, go back to your word that you don't like, Joe, but vision for what is now the Great North. Northern Powerhouse as a brand seems to be disappearing. So we're the Great North now. Well, it's not going to be particularly great if we don't get that investment into much better connectivity on our railways. So we'll see if the government's have any announcements for that. I think what we would all agree on this morning is whatever the government's longer term plans are, in the short term, they're getting themselves into a little bit of a mess. And the messages aren't getting back from businesses. Still some patience there, but it's wearing a bit thin. And so Rachel Reeves, Johnny Reynolds and co perhaps need to, once they've got their Christmas pudding digested, get out and about and start that charm offensive with businesses once again. Anyway, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, Keir Starmer, his air miles and what's going on with the UK and international affairs. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to part 2 of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, and my erstwhile colleagues Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. In the first part of the programme, we were talking about Labour's struggles with business, but Keir Starmer, well, he's certainly clocked up the air miles since becoming Prime Minister. I think with some justification. There was a requirement, a need for the UK to re-establish its reputation on the world stage, and the Prime Minister has been doing his best to achieve that particular objective. And his trip recently, for example, on Armistice Day to Paris was a welcome signal that the UK, alongside our friends across the Channel, was still very united when it comes to matters European. And I suppose they had at least one eye, if not one and a half eye, on Ukraine. But there is sort of to be some criticism in terms of the amount of time that the Prime Minister is spending out of the country. And again, Joe, it's been suggested that perhaps this is why that communication strategy that we've been banging on about for some time, that messaging, and the fact that there does seem a lack of coordination in terms of the policy announcements and the way it's all coming together or not coming together, as the case may be, maybe as a result of the leader being a bit too absent.
Yeah, and it is always a problem. I mean, it's really important that we have a space, a place on the world stage, and probably never more so than right now with what's going on in the American election and Ukraine and the Middle East. So it is terribly important, and it's also important that this is a reset after 14 years of the Tories and the reputation that was comprehensively trashed by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and their cronies and allies. And I think, you're absolutely right, Frank, for Starmer to be at the D-Day commemorations, armistice commemorations next to Macron, first Prime Minister since Churchill, really important. Did he need to go to the COP meeting in Baku? Ed Miliband could have done that, because, there weren't very many world leaders there. And actually, that was one of those events where you think, well, that's a total waste of time. It's a gravy train, and not, apart from that, it was held in an oil-rich country that has got no commitment to combating climate change. So I think, and he's on his way right now, or arriving shortly, in Brazil for the G20. That's very important. But I think, there is this, as you know, Frank, because I'm sure you are one, good managers understand how to designate, delegate, and disappear. And at the moment, all that Keir Starmer's doing is disappearing. And if you've got people around you who you trust, then actually send Ed Miliband to COP. Send somebody else to the other things. There are some things you can't get out of, and there's some things that you shouldn't get out of, but you can't let it unravel. Because, the rest of us sitting at home, looking out on the bleak weather, wondering about, how we're going to afford the heating bills, etc., or whether our jobs are going to be secure, are not really interested in a communique that comes out of some event thousands of miles away that has very little bearing. And I know that is a simplistic thing, because many of these things ultimately do. In terms of relationships, Starmer's talked about trying to reset our relationship with China, which is important. But, we do need, or he needs to really, really look at what's happening at home and who's running things while he's not here. Because I think that's what's, you've got Wes Streeting going off on his assisted dying thing that he is very opposed to. But I would argue he is abusing his position as a cabinet minister, as Secretary for Health, to have undue influence on that. And you've got other people like Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary who Jim referred to earlier, and other people doing their bit, but it doesn't seem to be joined up. And you sort of think, come on, where is this going? There's lots of people doing reasonable bits of medium management, but that's not enough to get them. It's not enough, and Labour need to realise, never mind Christmas bloody pudding, they need to be looking to May, local elections. And the way things are going, they will lose a lot of seats. And that danger is that they lose them to reform. I would hope they lose them to the Liberal Democrats, obviously. But, reform are making waves and will continue to do so. And if people carry on feeling as pissed off as they are at the moment, then Labour's got to look to something else. So he does need to get a grip.
Yeah, I'm not as bothered about the perception, let's say, of these trips abroad internationally, because I think that people even know he's there, a lot of the time. But it is this point about who's managing the shop. And it does appear to me that things are disjointed. It does appear to have a lack of collaboration across government at this moment in time. Ministers going off and making statements. Wes Streeting's statement you've referenced there, Joe, and Prime Minister's actually admonished him for that. And I think this is the problem. If you are out and about and traveling the world, then it's difficult for you to keep a track on domestic issues. what's your take on it, Jim? Because you've seen an awful lot of prime ministers become distracted with world affairs, and it does sometimes damage them at home, doesn't it? I wasn't being facetious when I said you've seen lots of prime ministers.
No, I failed to slip in my my joke that has to be cracked at every podcast now. When we were talking about that Tory minister who didn't know how far apart we were from across the English Channel, Dominic Raab, because of course, just after the Ice Age, we had the Doggerland where we were connected to Europe. So all these Brexit things needn't have happened if it hadn't been a deluge of water coming down and splitting us off from the continent. And of course, I was there to report it. Sorry about that. I mean, yeah, it's generally true that in their sort of second term, prime ministers get a taste for the world stage rather than the petty stuff at home, principally because when they're abroad, they're generally feted and people are polite to them, and it's a sort of prestige thing. And you guys are sort of arguing that this has come early to Keir Starmer. I would slightly defend him in the sense there was reputational damage big time to be dealt with, and therefore it was important for him to go to these things. Also, you know, prime ministers are not totally masters of all they survey. I mean, there's so many COPs and G20s and G7s. You know, the calendar is pretty full. It's a bit like the football world. So obviously they can take decisions not to go. I do slightly disagree with you about his decision to go to COP because, frankly, because of Trump's victory and also the COP is. It seems to have had some problems in Azerbaijan. It was always going to be problematic going to an oil state, as you say. You know, in a sense, he was trying to keep that on the agenda. So I would defend him for that. But just finally, he is going to be coming back to this country for a very important meeting next week about social care, where we understand that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, the Treasury and the Department of Health are at loggerheads over what to do about this. And there's going to be a sort of mini summit between Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, where he'll be reminded, as you say, that it's the domestic issues at the end of the day that people care about less than the wider parameters of international conferences.
What I would just say, though, Jim, to come back to you, if you are going to COP29 for the reasons that you've just said very eloquently and made a good case for it, then what you do is you coordinate an announcement back at home about net zero, about green energy, about green jobs. You know, so you show that what you're doing there is linked up with what is going to affect Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs down the road. And that's what they're not doing. You know, if you're going to, you know, G20 to talk about China, at the same time, you need to talk about imports, trade, Europe, free movement, etc., etc. You know, all of these things can be married up, as you and I, as communications experts, know that you can actually make these things work so that you've got the two things happening. You know, we need to be on the world stage because we're affected by world events, but that's why we're doing this back home. But they're not doing that.
I still think, though, even if that communication strategy was in place, the challenge that they have at the moment is seemingly lack of coordination across government. So the Prime Minister being absent is, it appears, enabling ministers to freestyle a little, and that needs to be got a grip of pretty quickly, I guess. Otherwise, things are going to continue to unravel, and you know, the assisted demise of the government, if I can put it that way, is being aided and abetted by some of these poor communications, let's put it that way. I think on occasion I have to say poor policy. You know, these announcements that are being made, from winter fuel allowance to the national insurance increases through to the fact that HS2 is not going to happen to crew. You know, these statements are just being made ad hoc. There's no preparation, there's no consultation. They're not bringing people close to them and explaining the reasons and the rationale, and there's an alternative, and this is why we're doing these things. They just stand up, make the announcement, and let the shit hit the fan. So Starmer needs to get a grip on that. And it's got to be the Prime Minister. It can't be Angela Rayner. It can't be the Chancellor. Important characters and personalities though they are, it's got to be, in this case, the main man, and that's Starmer. So whether its diary is getting clogged up with these international trips, Jim, and I take your point, then, I'm with Joe. I think Miliband should have been handling COP. There were few other world leaders in the room. It was poorly attended as far as that was concerned. And for me, Miliband should have been handling that. And next year, he's got to allow his foreign secretary to be taking some of these meetings abroad, because he does need to get a grip of the domestic agenda. That's my take on it. But a lot to do for Labour. We're only 4 or 5 months in, and that sort of pros and cons list, well, the cons list is getting bigger and bigger, and more challenges to come, because the Trumpster is being true to his word and appointing all sorts of lunatics to his cabinet. So the challenges that we thought would occur under Mr. Trump taking the White House likely to be happening come January. So lots of things that will be on his agenda on that international front. But as I say, domestically, my view, Mr. Starmer needs to get a grip. Right, guys, I think that's going to be it for this week. Other than to just reflect, Jim, on what was a fantastic memorial service on Tuesday for our old friend Sir Howard Bernstein, an absolutely packed Bridgewater Hall, rightly so, people paying tribute and homage to the great man. And what a moving and fitting tribute it was, James.
Yes, there were a number of surprising features of it. I thought the selection of speakers was excellent. We had Eamon Boylan quite rightly doing the tribute to all his achievements with infrastructure and things like that. We also had a delightful contribution from a guy from New York who aided the people taking over Manchester City, because of course Sir Howard masterminded that move from Main Road to the Etihad and all the development in East Manchester. He was a refreshing addition to it. But that's the most moving, yeah, I'm grateful for that. And then the family tributes, because sometimes, in the nature of things, people are doing great things sometimes neglect their family, but the warmth of the family tributes I thought was particularly outstanding. And of course, it was a gathering of 1,000 people, and people that you and I have known all our lives, Frank, are coming together. Those are still with us, and I doubt it'll be repeated again.
No, and I thought Osborne's comment.
Sorry, yes, that's the one I forgot. Sorry,
George
yes.
Osborne.
Yeah. The presence of the Tories there. Michael Heseltine was in the audience. Greg Clark, another regeneration minister, and sorry, I was great admission there. The former Chancellor's speech saying he was the greatest local government officer of his age, and talking about. I mean, apropos what we were talking about earlier, that was a moment. It was only a moment when the Chancellor was fully identified with trying to help the North through the Northern Partnership. And it was, I mean, we can argue about whether it actually achieved as much as it should have done, but for a while you had that political drive from the very top to make it happen, which is very elusive and doesn't seem to be present now. But yes, it was a very, very special event indeed.
Yeah, and afterwards, some family and friends went across to San Carlo, one of Howard's favourite haunts. And what struck me was the number of people who were regaling tales of the help, support, encouragement, mentorship that he'd given them, and some big characters and personalities from the Manchester business community who can all trace back the success in some way to Sir Howard's input. And I am downtown in business certainly grateful for the support he gave us over many years. So yeah, it was a great way to, as I say, pay homage to a great man, and thank you to the family for the invitation and for letting me and Jim and others be part of it. Right, guys, on that note, we will close for another week. We will be back in 7 days' time, talking, I think, a little bit more internationally. finding out what's happening in the Middle East, Ukraine, and what that Donald Trump presidency will likely mean come the new year. Enjoy the next week. We'll see you soon.